Good evening. Welcome to Size of Thoughts, Conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick, and I'm the producer for the show. The things that you will hear over the next hour of the show represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions, quotations, in no way represent River West Radio. They are the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. Therefore, River West Radio is not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So, again, thanks for tuning in this evening. I'm joined at this point by first-time guest, Michael Gonzalez.
Hello, good to be here.
And expect later in the hour to be joined through the phone by Matthew Hall, returning guest. And for this evening, planning a sort of loose thematic follow-up from the conversation that I had a few weeks ago with Matt Hall, Stephen Giovanni, and myself, in which we discussed aspects of state power, imperialism, in terms of capitalism, police authority, implicit, in terms of sort of the sort of co-opting of forms of authority. To talk more about in forms of resistance. It's not entirely the same group of people, which in some senses has its use, so showing that as grad labor we are all eminently replaceable and can subbed out at different points. But so I guess the main question becomes partly, having agreed, as I think at least the three of us in discussion are, about inherent problems that have existed in effectively all societies, including our own. What becomes the mechanism for doing effective things about it? I mean, what are the time points, either just as historians or as activists or as political observers now, that can see individuals and groups of people were able to work effectively and mount, at least at a temporary level, what we call effective resistance?
That's the essential question, and I fear that we don't really have the answer to that question, but that's kind of what we're grappling with here. Just like to say, thank you for inviting me on, Jacob. I wasn't part of that earlier conversation, and I'm happy I listened to it, and I'm happy to be able to give some of my ideas. And I look forward to, hopefully, if Matt Hall calls in and we can have a discussion about that. So I was kind of a last-minute addition, and I don't have anything really prepared, but I'm happy to share my ideas, and really have got a lot more questions than I do answers for how we can be effective. But I'm an observer and a participant in many different social movements, and historically as well as contemporarily. So I'm happy to be here and be part of that discussion.
Excellent. Yeah, since we've come in sort of like this unique role as with history grad students. Partly in position where it is sort of our jobs to be critical, to be looking at structures and problems. So in some cases we are, in terms of taking classes and being employed to teach in the same of it, cynicism and problems, or at least that's sort of my interpretation.
Yeah, we were just talking about how, I was warning you how cynical I can be at times.
I don't think you're in really good company, but beyond that, it's the bigger question then, it becomes, what to do with that, or if indeed, among the past and your sort of litany of problems and hierarchies and atrocities, there are positive counterexamples, which I think in some. I talked last week in terms of with Beth Robinson about some times of it where in a point in the early 30s where a fair degree of focused work and effort, things of it did seem to pay off and make a meaningful difference in people's lives. But what's more striking, in most of the areas that in terms of I study and have taught, and certainly just in day-to-day operation of academia, is often just how little resistance there is, how few revolutions. And how even fewer successful ones, and even fewer that become actually aimed at actual.
And what does it mean to be successful? With every political revolution and with every social revolution, we have some minor success, but then look where we're at still with the state of the world, and in pretty much every country where left-leaning forces, if you will, or those who are seeking social justice, it still seems like you're banging your head against the wall. As far as the issue of the cynicism and being cynical, although we can't be overtaken by cynicism, and it presents a real danger. This idea that we can be so hypercritical that we immobilize ourselves. We need to guard against that. But there's something to be said about being, a healthy dose of cynicism. We do need to be critical and we need to be skeptical, and we need to critique. As a famous quote, the ruthless critique of all existing things. Early Marx quote. So yeah, we need that. We need to be very critical, and because if we're not intellectually honest, then we're not really contributing what we're supposed to be contributing as historians to the debate and to the discourse. We need to. There's a famous quote by the Italian Marxist Gramsci, who I really like the quote. And I've talked with some of my friends and former colleagues about this, and some of them, they don't like this, but it's something to the extent of, and I'll speak Italian. I don't remember exactly what it was in the original Italian, but something to the extent of we must have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. In the sense that, when we look at the task ahead of us, intellectually, it's easy to be pessimistic, and maybe we need to be because it's a healthy dose of reality. But we need to continue to find that strength of will to continue to push forward, and we can see that sometimes things are. The task that we have in front of us is impossible. But we dream the impossible. We dream the impossible. We need to do that.
It doesn't mean we disengage from it or through. And I guess, I thought that was the other Gramsci quote, in terms of, what is it, the policeman in your head is stronger than the policeman down the street. That just the factor of the learned patterns of obedience and just complacency and normalcy become a more effective way of safeguarding
internalize all
stability,
that.
which also puts in context of the question of what makes successful resistance. Or you could say there are zero. There haven't been any that have actually challenged and shattered old systems of power, and in terms of built constructive alternatives without falling through to their own in some cases gains, but not in terms of total break and things emerge. But I guess I would in some cases define it as even level of, in terms of successful resistance means getting enough people out into the streets to get massacred by the police. In the context of the Paris Commune, or Seattle General Strike, where or a more contemporary example, Tahrir Square, where there can be severe questions of how much is gained in the end, and awareness of just the strength of the physical backlash and the and being able to co-opt revolutionary sentiment.
And in the moment, we don't really ever know.
Right.
Things might seem so overwhelmingly negative, like with the Paris Commune. Just the fact that all of these forces seem to have been slaughtered, the mass slaughter that took place. But nonetheless, it provided inspiration and a sort of kind of a way forward in the minds of, although there were different interpretations taken of this, by Bakunin or Marx, but the way forward is kind of presented. And so, maybe we need to be careful not to get too depressed about. It's a pretty depressing topic when you talk about, thousands of people rounded up and killed.
But I guess still, and again, at the position of the sort of convenient removed person of it, that's not one of the people that being actively sort of killed that would have a different standpoint of it. But in context, in legacy, it still seems that it does a number of valuable things. Partly since, at some level, guess enough of sort of anarchists, enough of postmodernists to not think that there's things inevitable about the conditions of acceptance or society, that the power that have it is, based on own complicity in it, and so that invincible, enough people involved in it, it's not actually, fated to always be, defeated, even if there's a lot of just the tactical and logistical situation that make it unsurprising when that's usually how it plays out, and also just because those kind of events, have an opportunity of, I mean, the things that we talk about now, they're the things that allow us to see an actual, a left-inclined intervention into history, not in the sense of just internal doctrinaire or discussion of endless resolutions of it, but seeing and reshaping notions of politics and what's happening. I mean, I think that the things that that Seattle, actually, well, both Seattle major events might think of it. I mean, WTO and general strike in different contexts and somewhat different lessons of it. But in terms of anarchist movement in Spain, Paris Commune, just some of the strike actions and militancy in late 1910s, I think in particular, and I also talked with somewhat last week some of mobilizing and coalition building in early 30s that in terms of before some of the other red baiting crushed out of it. I mean, we learn things from that. First of all, I mean, it shows lines of power more clearly. I mean, the bigger issue often is that the more successful coercions are not the ones that are the most blatant, that are not simply in terms of you are a serf forever, obey this and run through, but make it, people go along a way that don't think it's, well, I might think it's bad, but it's not as bad, or that there's opportunity of getting better, or just have to, put head down and someday even you can become one of the bosses in the situation and have all those in terms of nice things that in terms of your employers do currently. So I think shattering that becomes useful as an opportunity that makes it clear that the line not just of the snarling, grisly fascist state is the policeman's truncheon and policeman's bullet, but that you need to
kill the policeman in our head, not the one in the street.
Kind of, but also see that by showing it, and that is also like the nice, sensible, reform, in terms of reformist, in terms of parliamentary, or in terms of like presidential one of it. Well, also, when chips come down and it's a issue of property being threatened or destroyed, or the stability of elites being threatened and challenged, they will also have the truncheon, the tear gas, the rubber bullet, the non-rubber bullet. So I guess, it feels in some level that I'm just arguing for the need for creating martyrdom as a run-through, but it does seem that that's often, what's strategically useful, even in some cases, even making some gains.
Well, and I'm thinking, as I'm listening to what you're saying here, I'm thinking about one of the dilemmas that we're facing in our contemporary situation here is that it seems so clear to me, at least, and I think a lot of listeners might disagree, and I think most people probably would disagree, but it seems so clear to me that the liberal democratic institutions that we have set up in this country that are supposed to be, a form of sort of a modified form of, democratic rule are so corrupted and at their very nature are, as somebody who's coming from a sort of like anarchist communist perspective as I have, it just seems like one of the things holding us back is this, how do you say, this idea amongst, even those on the left, that the only legitimate forms of struggle, and I think they might even say maybe not only legitimate, but the only practical forms of struggle as well, are using the apparatus of state power and so elections and the endless cycle of elections become wrapped up in these social movements, and I think it's to the detriment of the social movements. So one of my big critiques is this idea that if we only vote every 4 years or every 2 years or whatever level of election you want to vote, this is what we need to do to have your voice heard, and it just seems like it's holding us back. And there's maybe good arguments that could be made about why we should not abandon electoral politics altogether. Personally, I think if we really want to see fundamental change happen, those of us who might consider ourselves radicals, who have, want to see a fundamental shift, a radical shift in, getting rid of racial oppression and getting rid of, capitalist oppression, that I think we need to move beyond the electoral politics, the realm of electoral politics, and really start to think about, even if we are going to appeal to those who are in positions of power, that just getting a Democrat elected is not going to solve our problems. In fact, it might be worse in some weird way. So it's just this idea that, and it comes back to what we, the discussion you had a couple weeks ago about the Spanish Civil War, and I was, I knew that. I'd listened to that broadcast, and I knew that that Matt's area of interest was, had to do with the anarchists and the Spanish Civil War, and was kind of rereading some of the literature that I have that I've read over the years, and one of the big debates at that time was whether this anarchist federation, anarchist trade union, the CNT-FAI. Well, it looks like we have a caller.
Hello, Matt. Is that you?
Yeah, it's me.
Hey.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Mike.
No, yeah.
It's perfect timing,
Yeah,
it seems.
we were sort of, it felt like we were like heavily giving the cues, or as if our audio equivalent to the giant bat signal to summon out the one among our sort of three who has studied the Spanish Civil War context the most.
The so-called expert. Well, maybe I can finish my point real quick, and then we can get Matt's thoughts on this. And like I'm just beginning the program here at UW Milwaukee, so I don't consider myself really an expert in any historical period, let alone the Spanish Civil War. But what I do know is that there was this sort of conflict within the different forces within the CNT, the anarchist trade union. The question being when and I don't know how much our listeners know about this history, but there was a fascist uprising and sort of workers' response in Madrid and Barcelona and other places, and one of the conflicts that arose within the forces of the left is, do we push forward this social revolution, which the grassroots seem to want to do in a lot of places, in Andalusia and parts of Catalonia and elsewhere, or do we collaborate with the republic, with the government, and that this avowedly anarchist, anti-political organization, in the sense of like not wanting to participate in the state, takes the audacious move of actually participating in a coalition with the other forces of the left, the socialists and the communist parties and the other Leninist parties, the non-Stalinist parties, and so they actually enter the government and in essence play a sort of counter-revolutionary role in trying to convince their own base that what we need to do is the revolution will come later, and instead we need to focus on winning this war against fascism. And many in the base, from what I understand, thought, well, aren't they interlinked? How can we be fighting against fascism if we're not talking about social revolution? And so it just seems to me like we're kind of continuing this even within those so-called anarchist forces today, this idea of like, well, if we give up, in the same that they were facing back in 1936, if we give up the ability to participate in this electoral coalition, we're giving up our voice. But at the same time, are you giving up your ideals if you are actually participating in a coalition that forces you to become a defender as like as somebody who's maybe an official or sort of higher up in this anarchist trade union, and you're now becoming a member of parliament or whatever your role is. You're forcing, in essence, you're forced to defend this state that is something that you're avowedly you're supposed to be smashing. So, and I don't know if that gives you too much to go with there, but kind of just rolling off the top of my head, this is some of the thoughts that I have about that period of time and some of the problems that the anarchist forces were facing amongst themselves.
Right, and I agree with your earlier point too about sort of the electoral politics today takes a lot of the impetus, I think, out of our ability to respond to things and effectively. We think, well, we'll just the next election cycle we'll get them then, and that's definitely the case with the situation in Spain was definitely a case, I think, where they, in an attempt to better defend what they had, they sort of surrendered too much, and it backfired on them. Then being, I guess, the CNT and the anarchist labor movement in Spain in the 30s. 20s and 30s. So, yeah. Yeah. I definitely, yeah. No, I totally agree with your point. I really don't have a lot to add to that.
I guess also, Matt, yeah, it seems that we're talking about partly, I mean, the notion of politics and the overall size of it. I mean, in terms of the amount that which people are, actually engaged in controlling decisions made, so that, I mean, the appeal, I mean, I think many people, and including myself, of it, to Zeneca's viewpoint of it, is that it's, not a matter of, simply, throwing away the electoral tool, but in many, but some cases, not, some cases throwing that away is being sort of countereffective or just frustrating past the point of reason, but also kind of just expanding, in terms of what are actually involved with what actually communities and groups of people and in terms of workers in terms of particular. So yeah, maybe I guess it seems that Spain becomes. I mean, I'm sorry. Go on.
Well, I was going to say, I think this is, and I thought this earlier too, that I wouldn't say, I don't think we need to ditch the whole electoral apparatus immediately, but there is sort of the idea of dual power, and so acting locally and things like that, I think being maybe the most effective way to give people a real voice and sort of real agency in their lot in life, I guess. So I mean, and that's something too that I think there's some really good correlations, I guess, with what I do. Plug my own research again with the situation in Spain, because you had not just a military response from the working class, but you also had this social revolutionary response that resulted in the collectivization of factories, farms, things like that, spontaneously, not the Joseph Stalin collectivization of the Ukraine-style collectivization, but something a little more friendly, maybe. Well,
and maybe not even identifying themselves always as anarcho-syndicalist or anarchist. I mean, it was so grassroots in some ways that people weren't even using that language all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a lot of cases, I think, not maybe a lot, but in some cases you would definitely have that situation where it would just be, that was just what you did. The boss or whoever would hightail it out of town, or you would make him hightail it out of town, and you would sort of reorganize things.
Yeah, which seems, I mean, in some ways, if it's a single litmus test for resistance coming to a level where it matters in its functioning society, it becomes when things that are, in retrospect or in larger context, I mean, pretty radical and pretty challenging to the norms of how functioning before become not just producers of sort of self-regarded radicals or people living at or around campus bubbles, etc., but people who just regard themselves as might even be non-political, but still it makes immense sense at this point to take the landlord's estate and carve it among me and my neighbors at that point. I mean that just the standpoint. I mean, I guess the left has sort of seems like often an endless cycle of where are the numbers of it, or more people for marches, more people committed, but it seems that the particular periods when you actually do have communities informed, I mean, it's not just, it's good to have more people on your side if you're fighting in terms of against sort of Stalinists or the fascists, but it also becomes a model that's actually more sustainable, that isn't sort of that fairly small group that's just looking of why aren't the masses behind us,
following us. Yeah, and I like the point that Matt, you bring up the idea of agency and kind of how people were so involved, directly involved, grassroots involvement, sort of a bottom up approach to revolution that you that I think is a lesson that we can take for today in our social movements, and I think it's we got to be careful not to just say, okay, we're gonna take everything that they did or that they did right or that they did wrong. I mean, we have a different context that we're operating in today, but this idea that if we really want to see fundamental change, what we need is to have a populace that is actively engaged in their own struggles for their own their own fights against oppression, and and there might be lots of different forms of oppression that they're facing in their own communities, but people need to be actively involved, and voting is probably the least active way that you can be involved.
Right.
And I think that we need to be careful that we don't just talk ourselves down. I think back to this this discussion, this forum that happened in River West here 3-4 weeks ago. I'm not sure when it was. It was over at the Public House, and the discussion was, where do we go from here? The recall's lost. The supposed Wisconsin uprising of 2011 seems to be the wave has crested, and things don't seem to be in as positive a position as we previously were. Where do we go from here? And I was struck by the panel. There was a diversity of viewpoints, but a number of people on the panel, probably more than half, it seemed to me, were kind of urging a sort of conservative position that there's nothing else we could have done, and the recalls were all that we could have done. And I don't want to rehash all of the arguments, but one of the things that really struck me was that there was all of this. They were using sort of misrepresentations of history in order to urge sort of inaction, and instead say, well, the recalls are what we had to do, and that's what we did, and I guess that didn't work, but there's no other option, and it's sort of like, there's lots of other options, there's lots of other things we can do, and I don't claim to have any sort of crystal ball to know what, whether this movement or that movement is always doing the right thing, and I don't think we ever really know. We just move forward. But I think one of the things that we need to really consciously do is, whatever our tactic is, we need to build working class power in their, people in their own lives having power and control over their own communities. And so however that looks, simply urging people to vote is not going to do it. Now, if people want to be involved in politics and the elections, fine. I'm not going to fight with people about it, and I wish them luck. But I would urge, instead of focusing so much on we need to get Democrats into power, or we need to, get, even if it's like the Green Party, getting the Green Party into power, focus more on sort of like building social movements that can pressure whoever's in power. If that's what you're doing, if you're trying to get concessions, if you're not organizing for, taking the whole pie at once, if you're trying to get concessions,
it might seem as a more workable tactic in some cases, but
I think, well, that was, sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree, Mike, in terms of with that panel and some of that, I guess particularly Chris Franz's sort of use, appeal, of the, glories and accomplishments of organized labor in terms of why they need to be, people still stood behind them, and why, in terms of AFT, SEIU, et cetera, were the best chance for a positive change coming forward of Wisconsin, which I would profoundly disagree with in both senses. But I mean, the more immediately, the appeal back to accomplishments of labor, while at the same time, the same standpoint rejects the tools that allowed those accomplishments to work. I mean, if we're talking labor in the sense of CIO in 1930s, I think that becomes a rather different case. So it's part of the sort of appealing for the union identity, or one might say the union brand, or the union logo is run through a bit, in an absence of any actual meaningful challenge.
Yeah, we need to be critical of labor. I mean, I think that we need to support unionization, we need to support labor, and we need we need labor unions to be part of these social movements. But the sort of idea that that was put forward at that panel, that unions have, I think at one point he even said something to the extent of every major social reform, you can thank labor unions for that. And I'm thinking back to myself, are we really not going to be critical of the segregation within these unions? And we're talking about every major social reform came from unions. Is that we have African American workers fighting against their unions for. I mean, we look at the civil rights movement. I'm sorry, the unions were involved in some ways, but every major social reform came about from unions. I mean, the Memphis strike, these workers were fighting against their own union leaders at first, before they finally got AFSCME to even support them. Their own union leadership was. So we need to be critical. We need to be critical, but at the same time, from a perspective that supports building of the power of the working people. So
Well-
we don't just say unions are bad. We say this union's got some problems. What can we do to fix it?
Yeah, and I think actually that might be the key to a more effective labor culture in the U.S. would actually be to go after sort of some of the things that are wrong with the labor movement. I mean, that's always sort of been the you see surges, I think, in organization and labor activism in periods where there's actually conflict within the labor movement. I mean, when you have, the IWW and the AFL, or you have the AFL and the CIO, and unfortunately in both those cases, I guess the more conservative of the two wins out, but in the long run, but nonetheless, those are periods where you actually see growth, I think, in the labor movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that criticism, I think is really key because, just another example from, Appalachia, you actually had miners fighting against their unions to get black lung coverage because the unions didn't want to go up against the bosses for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and you have the same thing, going back to the situation in Spain. You have sometimes I think the key is to have a more maybe radical or more involved base, because that's what's going to make things more, that's what's going to really push change within the union, and that's what's going to get the members involved in these things and get them out in the streets, which in the end I think is going to be really the key. I mean, if you're putting pressure or if you're taking the whole pie, we'll just use that euphemism for whatever that might mean, I think in the end you've got to have people in the streets, and that requires thing, which I think just in a broader criticism has sort of been an issue in the U.S. on the left for the last few decades, has been just a real lack of organization. It's been a lot about identity and individuality, and that's all great, but in the end, you've still got to get people out there, and I think that requires going and talking to people. Which is,
And while we know,
fine.
sorry to interrupt. And while we in no way have I don't believe a radical base among the forces in Wisconsin. I think back to when I'm hearing you say this, I think back to the protests in 2011. We had sort of a spontaneous, if you will, massive demonstration of just bodies out at the Capitol day after day after day. And one of the things that was being talked about among a lot of the people there was this idea of general strike. This idea of pushing forward, more than just marching and more than just recall, but we have this, sort of what you're saying with the issues in Spain and the issues in Appalachia. We had a situation where people were talking about general strike. The South Central Federation of Labor in Madison, they had forums where they were. The grassroots, the rank and file, were talking about going on strike, general strike, or direct action in the case of groups like Voces de la Frontera and other groups that were pushing for more direct action, civil disobedience, and yet the decisions that are made at the highest levels by the union leadership and by the democratic leadership was essentially to funnel all of this energy into a sort of disempowering process of the recall process. Now, the recall, gathering signatures, there's a lot of people involved in that, and so they might argue that it wasn't disempowering for them, but the results kind of show that it clearly didn't empower enough people to feel like they wanted to go out and vote.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of evidence to show that both, union leaderships and a lot of professional staff, a lot of people who had stakes in a particular form of union form as it exists, in terms of working in some cases, even directly with police to have the Capitol be cleared, to not have that kind of pressure and through. And the fact they were even still trying to talk to Walker post-election, it was only sort of the absolute refusal to play by the usual rules of the game or make any kind of appearance of bipartisanship that in some cases by default led them to be supporting things much that were for a short time much more radical than would have wanted to. And I guess also in relation to this, it seems that within historians, within educators, that the past and previous precedent becomes, in some cases, as much of a problem as much as a resource. Not just that. I think there's certain radical potential in the degree of success. The things that a lot of default assumptions of that well, you can't. People couldn't do this. It would be impossible to have so many people vote without some kind of authority, whether it's in terms of your Marxist-Leninist cadre that's telling people the historical necessity and objectivity of it, or it's in terms of businesses that are making people work for business. Well, no. We know it actually does happen when not put down by artillery and bayonets. It is actually possible. So I think that's one part that's sort of a convenient amnesia, particularly people who don't consider themselves as politically radicalized to not draw attention to. But also, or even in some cases, studying those incidents but taking the wrong lesson from them, imagining that in the past it was necessary to do these sit-down strikes in terms of to put everything on the line, to not take these kind of more compromising methods. But this present day is sort of different. We don't want, here and now, we don't want to alienate people. We need to grow the movement through moderation and seeming the more reasonable party and not doing anything that might be construed badly, which I think a lot of evidence show that's exactly the opposite of how any movement has effectively grown. So so it becomes an interesting, even they have some of the debates that had within history department of that period of I think a tendency to assume that the struggles and debates, or even just the question, we don't know what will happen. There are major risks involved in any kind of strike.
Always are.
But that doesn't. There's not been a very easy or sort of effortless or even one that was completely obvious even by well-intentioned committed people that this need to be done. It always becomes a gamble. Yeah. But it's easier to say this one is in terms of as so much more of a gamble, and to not feel the actual connection or continuity with similar struggles and debates that have happened in the past, as I think exist.
Yeah, we mythologize, in a sense. We mythologize the past and make it so that we kind of immobilize ourselves. One of the things, going back to that forum, one of the things that was discussed there was this idea that, the general strike, and I think I'm kind of repeating a little bit what you're saying here, Jacob, is that the general strike here would not have worked for this reason, that reason, the other reasons, and then pointing to historical examples of general strikes and saying, and even pointing to Oakland and the Occupy Oakland back last, last October, November, whenever they had their big general strike, and saying, well, that wasn't even really a general strike because not everybody, stopped going to work, and we couldn't really have a general strike because not everybody would stop going to work, and the idea being that if you actually honestly look at the historical movements, the general strikes of the past, we gloss over the reality of it is that not everybody was on strike in 1886 in Chicago or in Milwaukee or in Seattle in 1920. Was it 1929? What was it?
1919, I think.
1919?
19.
Yeah.
And so we mythologize it, and in a sense we disempower ourselves, and speaking of that idea of, Jacob, that you're mentioning of this idea that we need to appeal to our base and we can't alienate people, and going on strike would only alienate, and so often in history we forget that these movements were movements that today seem so clear-cut, like the civil rights movement, and going back to Milwaukee here, the marches across the 16th Street, the Father Grappi Viaduct, they were so contentious at the time, and there was that same discussion about alienating the populace versus wanting to push forward struggle was going on then, and we gloss over that when we talk about these movements because everything seems so clear cut to us now. But
Right.
Father Grappi and the Youth Council, the NAACP Youth Council, and the Commandos got a lot of criticism for being too radical, for doing too much. And let's not forget that at these protests in here in Milwaukee, as well as the supposedly nonviolent civil rights movements in the South, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Marches, there were routinely people throwing bottles and rocks at the cops, and it was just contentious. And yes, those same debates were happening then, that we don't want to alienate people, but we forget that no matter what you're going to do, you cannot completely control how everybody relates or is involved in these social movements. And so to just be kind of just immobilized, or this sense that we're going to alienate, so therefore we can't do anything, is just you're learning the wrong lessons from history, and you're misrepresenting history in a sense.
Yeah. I think something else that sort of comes to mind for me talking about this, you brought up the general strike, which was I remember with that discussion, I was still in my undergrad in Kentucky at the time, and I remember people talking about that, and I was like, wow, I'm actually going to get to see this happen, and then it didn't, which was disappointing. But one of the issues with that, and with a lot of this kind of stuff, is that there are laws or sort of rules against it, or even some of the customs against that kind of thing, especially even just regular strikes. There's sort of this a legalism about or wildcat strike would be a good example. The boss says, the union boss says no, but the rank and file says, maybe it's not a bad idea. I think a lot of times in an attempt to be accommodating to everyone, and over the last several decades, this law and order mentality, legalistic kind of mentality has crept into all of these movements, where there's sort of this wariness of doing anything that might be breaking the rules, even while at the same time, again, mythologizing these past movements and sort of ignoring the fact that they were all breaking the rules.
Yep.
And they'll either gloss over that, or they'll say, well, it was more extreme. It was kind of repeating what Jacob was saying, but the time is not. This isn't that time. It's not like that now. And I think that can also be really damaging to sort of ignore the reality that just because it's a rule doesn't make it right. And I'm not arguing that people, need to burn things to the ground or anything, but there are definitely some rules that are made to be broken.
Yeah,
I think general strike laws and things like that might be some of those.
Yeah, we need to be careful, and I think you bring up good points about the legality of it. We can't just dive head first into every, impulsive idea that we have. But I think, you make a great point, and yeah, the general strike, any sort of strike by the state workers would have been illegal, and it could have resulted in mass firings. And yes, there was a lot to be lost there. And one of the things that was brought up at the forum that was at the public house, just to keep going back to this forum, because I think part of the idea here is that we wanted to kind of talk about the same thing that forum was supposed to talk about, is how do we move forward. One of the things they kept talking about is how the workers had so much to lose by going on strike, and you can't just ask somebody to kind of take this risk. And the reality of it is they had so much to lose by not taking every step that they could have done, because essentially what has happened, they've lost their voice, they've lost their union, they've lost the struggle. They may still have a job, but even in that case, a lot of people are leaving their professions anyway. Yeah. And it's ironic though that we have these people, and especially the people on the panel that were saying, people who are working class people not being able to to afford to take these risks, and at the same time, in almost the same breath, they're talking about the Palermo's workers strike, and how these people are taking a stand. And it's like, do we not see the irony here that we have these state workers who in many ways are a more privileged, sort of substratum of the working class, and not to say that they don't deserve to have more, but in a sense they have so much to lose by not struggling, and they're not, in many cases, the most destitute portions of the working class, and yet we have people who have a whole lot to lose, especially if we're talking about immigration issues and whatnot. Yeah. And they're taking a stand, and so this sort of apologetics for not doing anything just takes over.
I agree absolutely. I guess two other points related to that. I think that partly also with as educators and as teachers, and in some cases it becomes even more clear cut given the amount. Sorry. feedback thing. But given particularly the, cut to social services and the impact that that's going to happen, and the amount that's being lost there, potentially, honestly, in some cases, wouldn't be shocked if 6 years from now there's some partial restoration of collective bargaining and some run through. But I think that the cut to UW system, I'm not sure is coming back by any kind of internal working out. But that money and the ability to demonize and remove services, well, it's just so immensely damaging, and also, that makes the argument against the strike action as being either too risky a strategy or too damaging to the operation of the university or too damaging to students, etc. It just seem, I think, ludicrously short-sighted. But by the same token, the second point is that that there become clear structural reasons why this happens. Why you I think hear the views that did at the public house debate, and also that heard at the time a year ago. That there's just, of course, the safer, less challenging run-through is going to be appealing and is going to have a lot of ink and voice and online things of it to explain why that is just the best and necessary. We need to cool our heads now, not let the radicals ruin everything. Let's go through. This is this is a safer, more effective one that will matter. Of course, that's going to happen. But I think that also is something have to, challenge partly as, duty is, I think, historians to see the structures that are operating, the structures, that why, in terms of, again, why there is the policeman in your head that is arguing why you're going through it. Why in some cases I think that internal mental cop will make good reasons and will have a lot of people, and including a lot of people in academia, that are backing and arguing either explicitly or just implicitly. They might sort of on paper be arguing for more radical things, but but in the context of a Wisconsin protest, March 2011, will be saying, well, this isn't this isn't like Seattle 1919, this garbage isn't piling up, so this isn't the time to run through. The recall is kind of the best we can hope for. So that even that given even as tricky and hard to pull off as labor action can be, especially with rural Wisconsin that so few have any kind of experience with, still taking that plunge at least has a chance of being successful.
Yeah, we might fail, but it almost seems like we've got to take a plunge. The idea, and I think this goes back to this. I like the point you're making about as historians. We have to accurately, as much as we can, kind of assess these historical social movements. And one of the things that infuriated me at this panel was this misuse of history and a misrepresentation of history to play that really conservative role. And yes, we may not succeed in our general strike. We may not succeed in our civil disobedience, but it almost seems like when the old phrase, you need to strike when the iron is hot, we need to take a cue from social movements that you may not be able to predict what's going to happen. We make the revolution, but not at a time of our own choosing. And so when the moment arises, you need to push the movement forward. It may destroy your organization, but you push the movement forward. There's a famous book by Frances Fox Piven and Cloward, her partner of many years, that they wrote, called Poor People's Movements. And one of the essential lessons there was that, and too often in social movements, you see this focus on building your organization to the detriment of pushing forward the actual change that you're trying to achieve. And so your organization in some way or shape or form may be even destroyed by your social movement. But if you can move forward and try to build a sort of more a culture of resistance and build towards actual real substantive change, I feel like that's where we need to go with these movements. And I think back to the specific historical example that was brought up about the bus boycott, the Montgomery bus boycott. People were talking about going on general strike, and we should have gone on general strike. And one of the panelists said something to the effect of, well, the bus boycott, they organized for like 4 months before they did that. And, we weren't organized. We weren't ready to do the general strike, as if we had to have prefigured every sort of contingency before taking any sort of action. I'm not an expert in the Montgomery bus boycott, but I've seen some documentaries, read some books, and it seems to me, if I remember correctly, that was a moment of sort of strike while the iron is hot. Now, obviously, Rosa Parks got arrested on purpose. She was a leader in the NAACP, and part of the goal was so that she would get arrested so that they could then take this to the Supreme Court. That was the strategy of the NAACP. But if I understand correctly, the sequence of events, that simultaneously after this happened, there was a call that was put out, led by Joanne Gibson Robinson. I forget the organization she was in, but she was a sort of academic and a leader, civil rights leader in the area, and she called for a one-day boycott. This organization, I forget the name of it, a one-day boycott of the buses, and they had a big mass meeting at her church, which was her pastor happened to be Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it was at that first mass meeting where they called upon the people there to vote and to decide, should we move forward with this? Do we want to go on a extended boycott? And it was at that meeting that they decided to create the Montgomery Improvement Association, which is the organization that would do a lot of the organizing for the bus boycott. And so it almost seems, if I understand the history correctly, that it was sort of an afterthought and a very important one, but it misrepresents history to say that, oh, they had everything organized before they took any action. It was almost like, no, the call went out that, yet another, I think it said the flyer that went out that Joanne Gibson Robinson put out said something to the effect of another African American has been arrested for refusing to give up her seat. There had been others. Claudette Colvin was like a 16-year-old, something like that, high school student. The NAACP decided not to use her case, I think in part because she was like a teenage mother, and there, worry about the, making the movement look good or bad. But the idea was that the tensions were already high. This had already happened, and it was a moment where the base, the grassroots had said, yes, we want to do this. We'll figure it out. We'll organize it. And then, this misrepresentation of history to say everything was planned out in advance. We all had it. They had it all figured out, and that's why they succeeded. No, they succeeded because they kept at it. Not because they had everything figured out before they took any action.
And an aspect of the fluidity and indeterminacy that goes in with that. Well, at the same time, of course, there's a structural reason for people and organizers and involved with progressive political parties to argue for the need for organization. But in contrast, I'd say, revolution will not be phone banked. Revolution will not be put to opinion poll to make sure that it's going to succeed. And I think that there's always a measure of uncertainty involved with anything that's come to change, which in some cases even did, like in some things of Capitol that let it go as far as it did, like actually occupying the Capitol, etc. So I guess near close of show, if I'll have let that revolution not be phone banked serve as my concluding thought of things. Other things, Matt?
I really don't have anything else to add. I think that pretty much sums up the issue. So, good talk.
Thanks for joining us remotely through Kentucky, and enjoy the rest of the trip, hopefully.
Yeah, thanks for talking with us.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
So,
I'll see you guys soon.
very good.
Later.
All right. So, and I guess other final thoughts, Mike? Or
I think I've kind of unloaded, everything that was on my mind. The revolution won't be phone banked, but it will be on River West Radio.
One can hope.
It may not be televised, but it'll be streamed live.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on the show. Really
Sure,
appreciate
definitely.
it. And
thanks for being here. Hope that can continue as ongoing. It weaves in, like referenced several other past sort of discussions I've had with other people, so that this becomes hopefully part of a much larger dialogue to figure out, I guess, both it seem to sort of broader principles or strategies of this, but then more directly, what that means day-to-day life, what we can do to hopefully make a larger improvement.
And this dialogue is so important and so necessary because, I don't claim to have any answers. You know, I mean, I'm hypercritical of everybody else, but people need to be critical of my ideas too. And so that's what can move us forward. Is, you know, I can say, you know, you guys are all stupid, you don't have it figured out, and then you guys got to tell me the same thing because I don't have it figured out either. And this dialogue is where we can move forward.
Figure out, overcome our own inertia. So again, well, thanks to our listeners joining us. This has been Size of Thoughts. Encourage you in terms of stick around if you want to listen to the Killer Radio Show that will be starting in a few minutes, and also join us again next Tuesday, 7 p.m. Central Time, where in terms of discussion will be between myself, Steve Daly, and Randy Miller on more aspects of Milwaukee's past and individual explorations into the past and some of political implications about the kind of questions that people, even beyond an academic setting, have for asking about history. So again, listen, final notes for Size of Thought, for the in terms of Size of Thought's concluding song, Life of the Mind, and until next week, thank you.